The day my father's will was read, my brother smiled before the lawyer even opened the folder. That was the first sign my father had planned something ugly. We were sitting in a walnut-paneled office that smelled like old paper, leather, and the kind of money our family never talked about directly. My brother Blake had one ankle crossed over his knee like he was waiting for a golf tee time, not the dividing line between one life and another. I still had funeral mascara on my collar. Dad had been in the ground less than 30 hours. Sandra Bell, our father's attorney, cleared her throat and read the words that made Blake's smile widen. Mercer Industrial Supply, including controlling shares, executive authority, and all associated business assets, would pass to my older brother. Just like that. Blake didn't look surprised. He looked confirmed. I remember the blood rushing in my ears so loudly I barely heard my own name. When Sandra finally turned to me, her voice changed. Softer. Almost apologetic. To Catherine Mercer, she said, "Your father leaves his personal effects in the cedar office chest, his watch, and this." She slid a battered black ledger across the table. Not a folder. Not stock certificates. Not real estate papers. A ledger. The cover was cracked at the corners, the elastic band worn white from years of being snapped open and shut. It looked like something a butcher or a bookie would keep, not the president of a 40-year-old company. Blake laughed under his breath. "You got Dad's shopping list." Sandra's face didn't change. "There's also a note." She handed me a sealed envelope. My hands were shaking so badly I tore it crooked. "Katie. When Blake lies, count backward. You'll know where to begin." "Dad." That was it. "No, I'm sorry." No explanation. No love you. Just a warning. Blake leaned toward me and glanced at the page. "What does that even mean?" I looked up at him. For the first time that day, his grin slipped. Because I had already opened the ledger. And halfway down the first page, under a column of dates and amounts, was my brother's name. 3 times. And next to the most recent entry, written in my father's narrow block handwriting, were 5 words that made my stomach drop straight through the floor. Last chance before everything burns. If you're enjoying stories about real-life challenges, personal growth, and unforgettable life lessons, consider subscribing to the channel. New stories are released regularly, and you won't want to miss the next one. My name is Kate Mercer, and for most of my life I was the reliable one. That sounds noble when other people say it about you. In real life, it usually means you get handed the mess while someone else gets handed the title. My father built Mercer Industrial Supply from one warehouse and a borrowed truck into a regional supplier that served factories, hospitals, city contracts, and half the machine shops across southern Ohio and northern Kentucky. If something needed bolts, safety gear, industrial adhesives, filters, parts, or emergency overnight freight, we got it there. It wasn't glamorous, but it was solid. It fed 219 employees and their families. It paid for Little League fees, braces, mortgages, and more community fundraiser banners than anyone would ever count. Blake got the face of the business. I got the bones. He was 4 years older, taller, louder, and born with whatever switch gets flipped in certain men where a room opens when they walk into it. My father loved that in him. Or maybe he feared it. I never figured out which. Blake could shake hands for an hour and leave a room with 3 new clients, 2 admirers, and somebody else picking up his lunch tab. I was the one who knew which truck would fail inspection before maintenance flagged it, which warehouse aisle had a leak behind the shelving, which client was 3 late invoices away from default. By 38, I was operations director in everything but title. I'd been at Mercer since I was 19, starting summers in receiving, then dispatch, then purchasing, then logistics, then every crisis nobody else wanted. I knew the company from loading dock to boardroom. I knew which forklift groaned in cold weather. I knew who was hiding panic attacks behind perfect spreadsheets. I knew which customers lied. I also knew, deep down, that when my father eventually stepped aside, competence might finally matter more than tradition. That was my mistake. Our mother died when I was 26. Breast cancer. Aggressive, fast, merciless. She was the only person in the house who ever translated my father for me. He sees you, she used to say whenever I came home furious because Blake had taken credit for something I'd fixed. Your father doesn't know how to praise what he depends on. He thinks needing something is the same as loving it. I hated that sentence because it felt true. After Mom died, Dad got harder. Not cruel exactly. Just stripped down. Everything became business, numbers, outcomes, endurance. Blake coped by staying charming and moving farther from the grind. I coped by becoming useful enough that nobody could dismiss me to my face. I didn't marry young like most women in our town were expected to. I did marry eventually, at 32, to a good man named David who lasted exactly 3 years before he sat across from me at our kitchen island and said, "I feel like I'm married to your father's company. You just happen to sleep here." He wasn't wrong. By the time Dad had his first real heart scare, I was working 60-hour weeks and pretending that if I just held enough things together, somebody would finally say the obvious out loud. Instead, Dad died during a second cardiac event, and Blake inherited everything with a smile that came too fast. The first thing Blake did after the will reading was clap me on the shoulder like we were teammates. "Well," he said, "guess the old man wanted to keep us both involved." I stared at him. "You knew." He held my gaze for half a second, then shrugged. "He talked to me about succession, sure. I didn't know details." "That's not what your face said." "Oh, come on, Kate." He lowered his voice, just enough to sound patient instead of arrogant. "I'm not your enemy." "No, I thought. You're just the person who always gets handed the steering wheel after I build the road." Sandra gathered her papers slowly, watching us the way bomb technicians probably watched wires. "Your father did leave governance instructions," she said. Blake turned immediately. "Such as?" "For the first 90 days, no sale of the company without full board approval and lender review. No executive terminations above director level without documented cause. And no changes to benefit structures without a 2/3 board vote." Blake's jaw ticked once. "That's excessive." "Your father preferred the word stabilizing." I tucked the note into my purse and picked up the ledger. It was heavier than it looked. Sandra stopped me before I reached the door. "Kate." I turned. "Your father wanted you to have that for a reason. Don't dismiss it too quickly." Blake snorted. "What is it, some old expense notebook?" Sandra looked at him over the rim of her glasses. "Your father did not keep anything old without a reason." That should have comforted me. Instead, it felt like the first sentence in a threat. By Monday morning, Blake had moved into Dad's office. He didn't even wait for the flowers from the funeral to die. The framed condolences still covered the credenza when he called a senior staff meeting and stood behind our father's desk like he'd been born there. He wore one of those blue suits that announce confidence louder than words. Beside him stood a man I'd never seen before, tan, silver-haired, expensive watch, consultant smile. "This is Carter Vale," Blake said. "He'll be helping us review structure, strategy, and growth opportunities." Carter gave a little nod that managed to be both friendly and condescending. "Pleasure." Marisol Vega, our warehouse supervisor, shot me a quick look from across the conference table. Marisol had been with Mercer 14 years. Her father had worked alongside mine when the company was still one warehouse and a prayer. She had the kind of face that never hid what it thought, and right then it was thinking exactly what I was. Too soon. Too slick. Too planned. Blake launched into a speech about honoring Dad's legacy by modernizing, optimizing, and positioning the company for the next era. That was how he talked when he wanted something ugly to sound inevitable. Then he got to the point. "We need to simplify decision-making," he said. "Kate, I know operations has been your lane, but I'm restructuring reporting. Carter will temporarily oversee internal review, and I'd like you to focus on transition support. There it was. The demotion without the word. I folded my hands. Transition support to what? Blake smiled like I was being difficult in front of guests. To the new model. I run the model that currently exists. And you've done good work, he said, already turning away from me, but we need fresh eyes. Every face at that table changed in some small way. People looked down. Shifted in chairs. Calculated risk. I could have made a scene. Some part of me wanted to. Instead I said, fresh eyes usually cost more and no less. Carter chuckled lightly, as if I'd made a spirited little joke. Blake's tone cooled. Let's keep this productive. That was the second sign things were already moving faster than they should. The third sign came that night, when I opened the ledger at my kitchen table and realized it was not one book. It was at least 3. The front pages looked almost harmless. Dates going back 15 years. Amounts in neat columns. Names, initials, addresses. Some entries had short notes beside them. M. Torres, son's surgery, anonymous. D. Keene, furnace fire, don't let him refuse. L. Vega, bridge until chemo clears. A. Pollard, tuition, no paperwork. I stared at the names. Most of them were employees. Former employees. Widows. A retired driver. One guy who'd cleaned offices at night for almost a decade and left after his wife got sick. My father had been paying people. Quietly. Personally. Sometimes for hundreds, sometimes thousands. I turned more pages. There were years of it. Not company expenses, as far as I could tell. No account codes. No reimbursement notes. Just a private record of debts carried in one man's handwriting. Then, about halfway through, the ink changed. The entries got shorter. Sharper. Red tabs marked certain pages. And there, mixed among the aid and promises, were lines that made no immediate sense. BM 82,000, reversed through harbor. BM 140,000, last warning. BM 230,000, covered by house refi. CV, keep him away from Kate. If B lies, count backward. My chest tightened. BM was Blake Mercer. C.V. Could only be Carter Vale. And my father had written about both of them before he died. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I took the ledger to the only person left in the world who had known my father longer than the company had existed, Earl Donnelly. Earl had been Mercer's bookkeeper before software took over and accountants in Columbus started using words like integration and cloud migration. He was 72, half retired, and still fixed his own gutters because a ladder teaches you humility. He lived in a brick ranch outside Hamilton with his beagle, Mabel, and enough bird feeders to qualify as a minor sanctuary. When I showed him the ledger, he didn't touch it right away. "Tom gave you that?" he asked. In his will. That made him look older. He sat down slowly at his kitchen table, adjusted his glasses, and opened to the first marked page. His rough fingertip traced one of the names. He let out a breath through his nose. "Well," he said quietly. "Hell. You know what it is." "I know some of it." He looked up at me. "Your father kept official books like everyone else. Audited, taxed, clean. This," he tapped the page. "This was his conscience." I frowned. "That's not an accounting category." "No. It's the one banks never recognize." He flipped pages. Tom grew up poor enough that he never forgot what one bad month can do to a family. If somebody at Mercer got hit hard and pride kept them from asking, sometimes he helped anyway. Quietly. Didn't want gratitude. Didn't want gossip. That part, strangely, hurt. Because it meant there had always been a softer version of my father. Just not one he used much at home. what about these? I pointed to Blake's entries. Earl's mouth flattened. That's a different section of his conscience. He closed the book. Kate, there are things a father covers because he thinks he's buying time for his son to grow up. Sometimes all he really buys is a bigger disaster. I felt my pulse in my throat. What did Blake do? Earl looked toward the window, where a cardinal was attacking its own reflection in the glass. That's Blake's story to tell. Then why did Dad give me this? Because Tom knew Blake wouldn't. I pushed the ledger toward him. Earl, if the company is at risk, I need more than fatherly riddles. He rubbed his jaw. Start at the red tabs. Count backward from the newest lie to the first one. Your dad wrote patterns, not just numbers. Is the company in trouble? He took too long to answer. Trouble, he said finally, depends on how much of it Blake's still trying to hide. That afternoon, Owen Pike from First National called my office line. He had been Dad's banker for years. Polished voice. Careful phrasing. The kind of man who could tell you your house was on fire and make it sound like a scheduling matter. Kate, he said, I was hoping to catch Blake, but he's unavailable. He's in meetings. Yes. Well. This concerns lender reporting. We need updated cash position documents and clarification on 2 short-term draws made in the last quarter. I sat up. What draws? A pause. I assumed operations had visibility. No. Try me anyway. Another pause, this one sharper. Perhaps I should wait for Blake. That told me everything I needed to know. Owen, if there's a problem and he's not telling me, you're not protecting the company by shutting me out. He exhaled. There are discrepancies between projected and actual liquidity. Nothing unmanageable if addressed promptly. How promptly? Within 30 days. My hand tightened around the phone. And if not? The bank may reevaluate covenant status. In other words, if the numbers were worse than Blake was admitting, Mercer could lose access to the line of credit that kept inventory moving, trucks fueled, payroll stable. For a company our size, that wasn't a warning light. It was a cliff edge. After I hung up, I went straight to Blake's office without knocking. He was alone, leaning over Dad's desk with Carter beside him, both of them looking at a spreadsheet. Carter stepped back when he saw me, but not far enough. We need to talk, I said. Blake flashed annoyance. Can this wait? No. I shut the door behind me. Owen Pike called. What short-term draws? Blake's expression changed too carefully. Routine liquidity management. Try again in English. Carter lifted a placating hand. Kate, after a founder's death it's common to rebalance. I didn't ask you. His smile stayed in place, but only just. Blake straightened. We made some bridge moves while Dad was sick. It's under control. How much? He hesitated. How much, Blake? Just under 2 million. I stared at him. For what? Expansion positioning. Meaning? He gave me the same look he used to give teachers in high school when he was about to charm his way through consequences. I had an opportunity. Dad knew about it. That's not what I asked. Carter stepped in smoothly. The important thing is that the company needs nimble leadership right now, not panic. I turned to Blake. Did you use company credit to finance a side deal? Don't say it like that. How should I say it? Irresponsibly? Secretly? Stupidly? His jaw hardened. Watch yourself. No, you watch yourself. Dad's dead. You don't have him covering for you anymore. The room went still. For half a second, something raw flashed across Blake's face. Fear. Not anger. Fear. Then it was gone. You don't know what you're talking about, he said. I thought of Dad's note. When Blake lies, count backward. So I did. Not with numbers. With memory. 2 months before Dad died, Blake had started showing up unusually early. He'd become strangely attentive in executive meetings. Dad had cancelled a planned capital project without explanation. There had been a brief, tense meeting behind closed doors with Owen Pike. And one Friday afternoon, I'd walked past Dad's office and heard him say, low and furious, "This is the last time, Blake. Do you hear me? The last time." At the time, I'd assumed it was family noise spilling into business. Now I knew better. That evening I stayed late and pulled every report I could still access before Carter's temporary oversight locked me out of anything important. Purchase orders. Vendor terms. Line of credit usage. Freight contracts. Warehouse shrink. There it was, if you knew where to look: unusually aggressive inventory commitments, deposits routed through a subsidiary account, a consulting agreement with Vail Strategic Partners, and a pattern of cash strain hidden under timing tricks. Blake hadn't grown into the company. He'd been trying to leverage it. At 9:30, Mercer knocked lightly on my office door and let herself in holding 2 vending machine coffees. "You look like somebody reading their own autopsy," she said. "That obvious?" She handed me a cup and sat down. I trusted Mercer more than most people in my bloodline. She was blunt without being cruel, loyal without being blind, and had the rare gift of hearing what people weren't saying. Her dad, Luis Vega, had worked with mine until he died of pancreatic cancer 12 years earlier. Marisol had taken over supporting her mother and younger brothers before she was 30. "Blake brought in an outside consultant before your father was cold," she said. "That's not succession. That's a setup." "I know. So what's the setup?" I hesitated. Then I told her about the ledger. Not every detail, but enough. She listened without interrupting, eyes narrowing as I mentioned some of the names in the front pages. When I said her father's name was there more than once, she went very still. "My dad?" she asked. "Luis Vega, bridge until chemo clears." "There are several entries." Marisol looked down at the coffee in her hands. "My mother always said your dad paid for some things after insurance stopped covering everything. Dad wouldn't talk about it. He said pride made people ugly when they got sick." I swallowed. I didn't know. She let out a short laugh with no humor in it. Funny how many versions of the same man can exist. A long silence settled between us. Then she looked at me. "What do you need?" I almost said, "I need my father to explain why he trusted the wrong child and burdened the right one." Instead I said, "I need to know how bad Blake really is." Marisol nodded once. "Then stop treating this like sibling drama. Treat it like inventory. Follow the missing pieces." That was exactly what I did. Over the next week, the company began to change shape around me. Blake started holding private meetings with Carter and 2 board members I didn't trust, Gerald Pruitt, who cared about margins more than people, and Neil Babcock, who never met a private equity pitch he didn't want to date. HR got a request for efficiency scenario modeling, which was corporate language for deciding whose family could absorb unemployment. Procurement got told to freeze discretionary spending, except the executive floor somehow received new office furniture samples. More importantly, people got nervous. At Mercer, anxiety traveled faster than memos. Drivers heard from warehouse leads. Customer service heard from maintenance. Somebody noticed Carter measuring office square footage. Somebody else saw Blake taking a call in the parking lot and saying the words, "clean transaction timeline." By Thursday, 3 longtime employees had come to me separately to ask if they should be worried. I wanted to reassure them. I couldn't. That night, I went back to the ledger and started doing what Dad told me. I counted backward. The newest Blake entry was from 3 months before Dad died. Then one 5 months before that. Then 8 months. Then a year. Same initials. Larger amounts. Cryptic notes. Covered through harbor. Moved from reserve. House refi. Make him sign this time. No more from payroll. If he lies to Katie, she gets the book. I copied every Blake-related entry into a notebook, then traced other repeating references: Harbor, CV, Reserve, House refi. One name kept resurfacing near the older entries: Nadine Cho. Nadine had been Mercer's controller for 15 years before retiring early to care for her husband after his stroke. She was brilliant, unsentimental, and allergic to nonsense. If my father had trusted anyone with quiet numbers, it would have been her. I called the next morning. She answered on the fourth ring. If you're selling me windows, I'm hanging up. It's Kate. A pause. Then, what did your father leave you? I blinked. How did you know he left me something? Because Tom Mercer didn't do symbolism. If he singled you out, it was practical. I almost laughed despite everything. A ledger. Another pause, this one longer. Come by after 5, she said. And don't bring your brother. Nadine lived in a townhouse outside Westchester with her husband, Peter, and enough potted herbs on the patio to stock a small restaurant. She poured tea like an interrogation tactic and waited until Peter had rolled himself to the den before she asked to see the book. She scanned pages faster than seemed possible, lips pressed tight. He told me he destroyed this, she murmured. So you know what it is? I know parts of it. The early years were personal. Charity, private loans, moral bookkeeping. Later, she closed it. Later it became evidence. My stomach turned. Evidence of what? Of your father trying to save your brother from himself. I sat back. How? Nadine looked at me steadily. About 4 years ago, Blake entered into a speculative distribution agreement through a shell entity called Harbor Industrial Logistics. He pitched it as a side venture that would eventually benefit Mercer. He used reputation, implied backing, and eventually access he did not have the right to use. The deal went bad. How bad? He overcommitted product, guaranteed financing, and tried to float losses until a national contract came through. It didn't. Vendors came calling. One lender got close enough to pull at the thread connecting Harbor to Mercer. Did Dad know? Not until it was already on fire. I felt sick. And he covered it? Mostly with personal assets. Some bridge tactics. Some negotiations. Some humiliating apologies. I thought of the ledger line, covered by house refi. He refinanced his house? Twice. I stared at her. For Blake. For the company, Nadine said sharply. That's the trap with family business. By the time you figure out which is which, you're already bleeding for both. I pressed my palms against my knees. Why wasn't Blake out then? Because Tom still believed consequences could be delayed without being erased. It's a common parental fantasy. Why give him the company now? Nadine's expression changed. Not softer. Sadder. Because your father made his biggest mistakes in private and his biggest decisions emotionally. He knew Blake was weak. He also knew Blake spent his whole life believing he was only valued as a future heir. Tom probably convinced himself that handing him the title would finally force him to become the man he'd been pretending to be. And me? She didn't answer right away. You, she said finally, were the one he believed would do the right thing even while resenting him for asking. That landed exactly where it hurt. Nadine got up, crossed to a desk, and returned with a sealed legal envelope. My name was on the front in my father's handwriting. He left this with me 6 months ago, she said. He told me to give it to you only if Blake tried to sell, restructure benefits, or remove you from operations. I opened it with numb fingers. Inside was a photocopy of a document and a 1-page letter. The document was a voting proxy agreement signed years ago by 2 minority board members, effective only under certain conditions: material covenant risk, forced sale attempt, or executive misconduct threatening company continuity. In plain English, if Blake endangered the company within the first year, emergency authority could be transferred by board motion. The letter was shorter. Katie. If you are reading this, then I was right about 2 things and wrong about the one that mattered most. I was right that Blake would ask for what he hadn't earned. I was right that you would stay when you had every reason to walk. I was wrong to make you carry both burdens. Don't save my pride. Save the people. And do not confuse mercy with permission. Dad. I read it twice. Then a third time. By the third, I was crying so hard I could barely see the page. Not because it healed anything. It didn't. It was too late for healing. Too late for apology. Too late for every dinner table silence and every time my father had looked past me to the son he wanted the world to see. But for the first time in my life, he had written down the truth. Blake hadn't inherited Dad's confidence. He had inherited Dad's wishful thinking. And I had inherited the cleanup. The next conflict arrived 48 hours later, right on schedule, dressed as a board packet. Friday afternoon, Blake called an emergency executive review for Monday morning. The agenda said capital preservation strategy. Attached was a confidential summary proposing a partial asset sale, staffing consolidation, and benefit realignment. Translation: sell the Cincinnati warehouse, cut at least 40 people, freeze the hardship fund, and position Mercer for acquisition by a private equity group called Halcyon Distribution Partners. I read the packet twice in the dark of my kitchen while rain beat against the window. Buried on page 11 was the real knife. My role would be eliminated in the new structure. Not reassigned. Eliminated. Blake wasn't just trying to keep me away from the numbers. He was trying to get me out before the room knew what he'd done. I called Sandra Bell. She answered tired, like she'd been expecting me. He can't do this without a board vote, I said. Not fully, no. He's going to try. Yes. Did Dad tell you about the proxy? He told me he hoped I'd never need to mention it. I laughed once, hard. That sounds like him. Kate, she said carefully, if you use that authority, it will be war. It already is. I spent the weekend building the case. Not for myself. For the company. Mercer helped me gather operational risk summaries. Nadine reviewed cash exposure and linked harbor-related cleanup to current strain. Earl went through old files and found correspondence showing Dad had personally guaranteed obligations Blake had created. Owen Pike, once assured the bank would not be dragged into theatrics, confirmed covenant vulnerability in language careful enough to protect his job and clear enough to save mine. And then, on Sunday afternoon, just when I thought I had enough to stop a bad man with good paperwork, the story changed again. A woman came to my house. I was on my porch with a legal pad when an older Honda pulled up. The woman who stepped out looked to be maybe late 40s, tired in the way people get when life teaches them to reserve energy. She wore jeans, a navy sweater, and an expression that said she had rehearsed this moment and still didn't want to be here. Kate Mercer? She asked. Yes. She held up a folded page. I found your address in an old Christmas card from your father. The phrase your father, in that tone, made every muscle in my body alert. Who are you? My name is Elena Ruiz. She swallowed. Thomas Mercer used to send money for my daughter. Nothing in me moved. Then everything did. I stepped aside. Come in. We sat at my kitchen table, where apparently all bad truths in my life liked to arrive. Elena kept both hands around a paper cup of coffee without drinking it. She looked around once, as if checking whether she should really continue. Your father visited once a year, she said. Usually in November. Sometimes in person, sometimes he mailed a cashier's check. He said it was a promise. Promise for what? She met my eyes. For what your brother did. I went cold all over. Elena took a breath and continued before I could interrupt. 17 years ago, my husband Mateo worked in your receiving yard. One night there was an accident after hours. He wasn't killed, but his back was damaged so badly he never worked the same again. We were told the company would settle. We signed papers. Your father said the insurance would cover most of it, and he would make sure our daughter got help for college later. He kept that promise. I heard my own voice from far away. What does Blake have to do with it? Her eyes filled before mine did. Mateo said the young man driving was your brother. He smelled like whiskey. Your husband, she stopped herself and corrected it. Your father made us swear not to say that. He said Blake was stupid, not evil, and that one public scandal would destroy everyone tied to the company. I gripped the edge of the table. No police report? There was a report. But the version that remained said the truck rolled during unauthorized movement by staff on site. Mateo signed because we were scared. He needed treatment. We needed money. Something hot and terrible rose in my throat. Why tell me now? Because your father is gone. She reached into her purse and laid a faded envelope on the table. And because your brother came to see me last week. I stared at her. He asked me to sign something new, she said. A statement saying my husband had misremembered details because of medication. He offered money. More money than we've ever seen at one time. My vision sharpened in that awful way it does when fury becomes pure. What did you do? Elena gave a humorless smile. I told him if he came back to my house, I would let my grandson answer the door with a baseball bat. Despite everything, I almost smiled. Then she said, your father wasn't innocent, Kate. But he carried shame. Your brother carries inconvenience. There's a difference. After she left, I sat alone in my kitchen for an hour without moving. The ledger had not been exaggerating. It had been under-explaining. My father hadn't just covered debts and bad business. He had covered harm. And now Blake was trying to bury the past a second time, likely because whatever deal he was building couldn't survive scandal, lender scrutiny, or family testimony. I wanted to drive straight to his house and throw the ledger through his front window. Instead, I did something harder. I called him. He answered on the second ring, sounding annoyed. What? Did you visit Elena Ruiz? Silence. Then, who? Don't. He exhaled. This is exactly what Dad was afraid of. You find scraps and start making everything dramatic. Mateo Ruiz didn't imagine you driving drunk. Another silence. Heavy this time. When he spoke again, his voice was flatter. You don't know the whole story. Then tell it. I was 25. I almost laughed from disbelief. That's your defense? I was a mess, okay, he snapped. Dad had me doing sales, pushing me into rooms I hated, telling everybody I was the future when I had no idea what I was doing. I drank too much. I made a stupid choice. Nobody died. Nobody died. I closed my eyes. Nobody died, I repeated. That's what you're going with. It was handled. By Dad. He saved the company. No, I said quietly. He saved you from consequences and called it protecting the company. Blake's breathing changed. Then he said something I didn't expect. You think he didn't do the same thing with you? I frowned. What? He used you, Kate. You were the dependable one, so he leaned on you until it bent your whole life. He gave me the spotlight and you the weight. You think that means he respected you more? It means he knew you'd stay. That hit because it was cruel and partly true. He pressed on. You want to talk about fairness? Try being told since childhood that the company would be yours someday and then spending your adult life realizing Dad trusted your judgment less every year. Do you know what that does to a man? I gripped the phone tighter. Apparently it makes him reckless and dishonest. He ignored it. Every time I failed, I could see it in his face. Not anger. Disappointment. Like I was breaking some public version of him. And every time you fixed something, he got quieter. Do you know why? Because you proved what he refused to admit. My voice was barely steady. Which was what? That he built the wrong kid for the wrong job. We said nothing for a few seconds. Then I asked the only thing that mattered now. Are you trying to sell Mercer before the bank sees how exposed we are? He gave a short, tired laugh. I'm trying to keep it alive. By cutting everyone who actually built it? By doing what has to be done? No. By doing what lets you stay in charge. His voice dropped. Stay out of this, Kate. Take a package. Walk away. Let me fix it. I looked at the ledger open beside me, the pages full of my father's private record of promises, failures, guilt, and last warnings. No, I said. And I hung up. Monday's meeting began at 8 and felt like a funeral for people who were still breathing. The boardroom windows looked out over the loading lot where trucks backed in under gray morning light. Men and women in safety vests moved through routines that paid their mortgages, while upstairs 3 board members and a consultant prepared to gamble with their lives using phrases like streamlining and strategic repositioning. Blake presented first. He was polished. I'll give him that. He laid out the liquidity strain, market pressures, rising freight costs, and competitive landscape in a voice built to make surrender sound responsible. Carter followed with slides about valuation windows and buyer appetite. Gerald nodded through most of it. Neil asked 2 questions designed to sound skeptical while helping move things along. Then Blake turned to me with false generosity. Kate, if you'd like to offer operational color before we vote. Operational color. I almost admired the nerve. I set my binder on the table, folded my hands, and looked first at Sandra, then at the 2 proxy-holding board members Dad had trusted, Helen Boudreau, a retired manufacturing executive with no patience for vanity, and Reverend Marcus Bell, who'd served on the board mostly because my father believed one decent man in every room increased the odds of wisdom. I would, I said. But first I need clarification on whether this board is being asked to make a decision with full and truthful information. The room shifted. Blake's face remained composed. Of course it is. I opened the ledger and placed photocopies in front of each board member. Carter leaned forward. What is this? My father's private record, I said, of personal guarantees, concealed liabilities, and repeated financial interventions related to Blake Mercer. Blake's chair scraped back an inch. This is absurd. No, Nadine said from the doorway. Every head turned. She stepped inside carrying a banker's box. Marisol came in behind her, followed by Owen Pike in a dark suit that looked freshly miserable. Blake stood. What is this? Who authorized? Helen cut him off. Sit down, Blake. He didn't. I did not raise my voice. I didn't have to. For 4 years, I said, Blake used implied company backing and direct company exposure to support an outside venture called Harbor Industrial Logistics. When that venture failed, Dad used personal assets to cover losses and keep Mercer insulated. Those losses are tied to current cash vulnerability. Meanwhile, we are being asked to approve layoffs and asset sales without full disclosure of the decisions that created this situation. Carter stood too. This is inappropriate and potentially defamatory. Owen slid a folder onto the table. First National has reviewed supplemental materials. Based on what we've received, the board should not proceed with any major transaction until governance and exposure questions are resolved. Blake turned on him. You're breaching confidentiality. Owen adjusted his cuff. I'm protecting the bank. Good for him, I thought. At least somebody was. Nadine opened the banker's box and began handing out copies of old guarantees, wire records, and settlement correspondence. Then I put the final nail on the table. A copy of Elena Ruiz's unsigned statement and a record of Blake's recent visit. Sandra's voice came cool and sharp. Is there any reason, Blake, that you approached a former settlement family last week asking for revised testimony? For the first time in my life, I saw my brother truly cornered. He looked at Carter. Carter looked away. He looked at Gerald. Gerald stared at the papers like they might rearrange themselves into a safer story. Finally Blake looked at me. And in his face I saw not a villain from a movie, not a monster, not some easy thing I could hate cleanly. I saw a man who had been protected so long he mistook rescue for entitlement. A man who had lived inside one big unearned promise until it hollowed him out. That was private family history, he said. Helen's voice could have cut steel. Not when it creates corporate liability and ethical exposure. Blake turned to the room, trying one last time to seize control. Everything I did to grow this company. Dad knew that. No, I said. Everything you did to avoid feeling small. He flinched. It was the truth, and we both knew it. Reverend Bell folded his hands. I move that pending full forensic review, Blake Mercer be suspended from executive authority under the emergency governance provisions established by Thomas Mercer. Helen said, second. Blake stared at me like I had pulled the floor out from under him. Maybe I had. Sandra called the vote. It passed. Just like that, my brother lost the thing he had been promised his whole life. And I became the person standing between 219 families and the consequences of everything our father had postponed. You'd think that would feel like victory. It didn't. It felt like being handed a burning building and told not to let the windows break. News spread through Mercer faster than I could contain it. Employees didn't know details, but they knew enough. Blake was out pending review, big decisions were paused, the company was under stress, and I was now serving as interim operating head alongside board oversight. Some people looked relieved. Some looked terrified. A few looked at me with the kind of expectation that makes breathing harder. Because now I had to do more than expose a problem. I had to solve one. The next 3 weeks were the hardest of my professional life. We froze executive spending, renegotiated vendor terms, delayed a non-critical expansion, and sold 3 unused fleet vehicles instead of people's livelihoods. Owen worked with us on a tighter covenant plan once the bank saw adult supervision had returned. Nadine came back part-time to help rebuild financial visibility. Marisol reorganized warehouse staffing so efficiently that we improved turnaround without layoffs. Helen leaned on board members who suddenly rediscovered moral language once their names might appear on the wrong email chain. And me? I worked like the woman David had left years earlier. Only this time I knew why. Not for Dad's approval. Not to prove something to Blake. For the people whose names were written in that ledger. The ones Dad had helped quietly, yes, but also the ones he should have protected more openly. Some nights I stayed in Dad's office long after everyone else had gone, going through files and letters and legal pads, trying to understand the man without excusing him. I found birthday cards from Mom with jokes scribbled in the margins. I found a Polaroid of Blake and me in rain boots beside the first warehouse, both missing front teeth, both grinning with muddy knees. I found a church bulletin folded around a note in Dad's writing. Don't let success make the house colder. He had underlined colder twice. I sat there with that line for a long time. Because that was what had happened to us, wasn't it? Success had insulated our floors and sharpened our table manners and paid for college and lake weekends and a polished office with walnut walls. And the house had still gotten colder. One Thursday evening, about a month after the board meeting, Blake showed up at my office after hours. He looked terrible. No suit jacket. Shirt wrinkled. Stubble grown in. The confidence that usually arrived 10 seconds before him was nowhere to be found. I almost told him to leave. Instead I said, "It's late." He closed the door gently behind him. I know. I waited. He looked around Dad's office, then at me sitting behind the desk neither of us had ever really owned. I used to hate how easy this was for you, he said. I blinked. What? The work. The details. The fires. Dad would bark one sentence and you'd already know where the leak was. He laughed quietly, exhausted. I'd be standing there still trying to figure out if he was angry at me or the supplier. This is not easy for me. No. But it's natural to you. There's a difference. I didn't answer. He sat down without asking. Carter's gone. That did surprise me. Meaning? I told him I wouldn't move forward with Halcyon. He told me I'd ruined my last leverage point and left. Blake rubbed his face. Turns out consultants are only loyal to invoices. That must have been a shocking discovery. He gave me a tired look. Do you want to punish me forever, or just the years ending in Y? I almost smiled despite myself. Old reflex. Then he said, I wasn't trying to destroy the company. I know. He looked genuinely startled. You do? Yes, I said. I think you were trying to outrun being exactly who you were afraid you'd become. His eyes dropped to the desk. After a long silence, he said, Dad used to take me on sales calls when I was 12. Did you know that? No. He'd buy me pie afterward and tell me the company was a living thing. He said if I listened long enough, I'd hear where it was hurting. Blake's mouth twisted. All I ever heard was him measuring me against some imaginary man I never quite turned into. I leaned back slowly. You think he didn't measure me too? He didn't measure you. He used you. That stung because again, there was truth in it. Blake looked up. I'm not asking you to absolve me, Kate. I know what I did. I know Dad covered for me too many times. I know I kept letting him. But I need to ask you something. I said nothing. Did he ever tell you he was proud of me? The question was so naked, so young underneath the grown man asking it, that for a second I could barely breathe. No, I said honestly. He didn't tell me much of anything like that. Blake laughed once and looked away. Figures. Then I did something I hadn't planned. I opened the bottom drawer and took out the church bulletin note. Here, I said. He read it. Don't let success make the house colder. His eyes moved over the sentence twice. Then he sat very still. He wrote that, he asked. Yes. Blake swallowed hard. He knew. He knew enough to regret some of it. That's not the same as fixing it. No, I said. It isn't. His eyes were wet by then, though he'd rather have bled than call it crying. Finally he set the note down. What happens to me now? That was the question, wasn't it? Justice. Mercy. Consequences. Family. All tangled together until you couldn't pull one thread without tightening the others. What should happen? I asked. He let out a breath. If I answer honestly? Try it. I should lose my seat. Pay back what I can. Stay away from decisions I keep screwing up. He paused. And I should probably apologize to people who'll never believe I mean it. That would be a start. He nodded once. Then he said, I went by Elena Ruiz's house because Carter told me any unresolved liability could spook buyers. I told myself I was containing risk. But when she looked at me, I realized I wasn't talking to a line item. I was talking to somebody who'd had to live with my worst night longer than I had. That was the closest thing to remorse I'd ever heard from him. And strangely, it made me angrier at our father all over again. Because this breaking open, this honesty, might have happened years earlier if someone had ever forced him to face himself instead of paying for the damage and moving on. You don't get to feel clean because you finally see the dirt, I said. I know. And I'm not handing you the company back because you had one decent conversation in a wrinkled shirt. He almost smiled at that. Fair. He stood to leave, then hesitated at the door. For what it's worth, he said without turning around, I was horrible to you because Dad already trusted you with the things that mattered. I thought if I could stay bigger in the room, I wouldn't have to notice. After he left, I sat in the dark office for a long time. That was the deep part of the grief no one warns you about. Not missing the perfect version of a person. Mourning the family you might have been if people had told the truth sooner. 2 months later, the forensic review was complete. It was ugly, but survivable. Blake's side ventures had done real damage, but because we had moved fast, worked with the bank, and stopped the sale push before it triggered a worse spiral, Mercer could recover. There would be no mass layoffs. No asset strip. No private equity fire sale. The board voted to remove Blake permanently from executive authority. He would retain a reduced economic interest subject to repayment agreements and legal conditions, but operational control would transition formally to me if I accepted. The night before that vote, I found one last envelope in the cedar chest from Dad's office. It had slipped beneath an old stack of trade journals and only surfaced when I lifted the bottom felt lining to check for hidden compartments. My father apparently trusted furniture almost as much as he mistrusted emotional conversation. The envelope had no date. Just my name. Inside was a letter, longer than the others, written in the unsteady penmanship of a man who knew his time was getting shorter. Katie. If this reaches you, then I ran out of courage while I was still alive. You deserved honesty from me long before death made it easier. I made Blake the promise of the company when he was a boy because I thought a son needs something to grow toward. What I gave him instead was a shadow he kept mistaking for himself. Every time he failed, I protected him because I believed one more rescue would become one more chance. That was cowardice dressed as fatherhood. I made a different mistake with you. I saw early that you did not need flattering. You needed trust, room, respect. I gave you responsibility and withheld the words that should have come with it. I told myself strength does not need feeding. That was another lie men of my generation told themselves because tenderness made us feel unarmored. You were the best part of this company long before I admitted it on paper. Maybe the best part of me too. If Blake has done what I feared, do not spend your life cleaning up men who keep mistaking your competence for permission. Help him only if help requires truth. And if there is any grace left in this family, let it be this. Break the pattern. Say what matters while people can still hear it. Love. Dad. I read that letter standing beside the cedar chest, one hand pressed against my mouth. There are words you wait your whole life to hear. Sometimes they arrive after they can no longer undo what their absence did. The next morning, I accepted the role. Not because it felt triumphant. Because it felt clear. We held the company-wide meeting in the warehouse instead of the conference room. I wanted no polished wood, no executive distance, no podium hiding behind jargon. Just concrete floors, metal shelving, folding chairs, and the people who actually made Mercer run. I stood on a low-loading platform with Marisol, Nadine, Helen, and Reverend Bell nearby. Owen was there too, mostly to signal institutional stability, which is a phrase only bankers could make sound comforting. Faces looked up at me, drivers with crossed arms, customer service reps with tired eyes, pickers still in steel toes, office staff clutching coffee, mechanics smelling faintly of grease. I told them the truth. Not every legal detail. Not every private shame. But the truth that mattered. The company had been under strain. Leadership decisions had put Mercer at risk. Those decisions were being addressed. We were not selling. We were not planning mass layoffs. We were rebuilding carefully, and it would take discipline from everyone, especially from those at the top. Then I said something I hadn't planned until that moment. My father kept a private ledger, I told them. In it were numbers, yes, but also promises. Help he gave quietly when people were hurting. Mistakes he covered. Things he got right and things he got wrong. Reading it taught me something I wish our family had learned earlier, that a business is not just assets and debt. It is people. And if leadership forgets that, then no amount of revenue makes the company worth saving. The room stayed quiet. I kept going. So here's what changes now. No more secrets that cost employees their security. No more strategic language hiding human consequences. And over the next year, we will create a formal employee hardship and profit-sharing structure with board oversight, so generosity doesn't depend on one person's private conscience. It becomes part of who we are. That was when the room changed. Not dramatically. No movie applause. Just shoulders lowering. Eyes lifting. People listening with the cautious hope of folks who have been disappointed before and still want to believe. After the meeting, Mercer found me by the dock doors. My mother would have liked that, she said. The profit sharing? The truth. I looked out at the lot where trucks were leaving for first runs. I'm late to it. She bumped my shoulder lightly. Late isn't the same as never. A week later, Blake asked if I'd meet him at our mother's grave. I almost said no. Then I thought of Dad's line, help him only if help requires truth. So I went. It was a cold afternoon, the kind that makes every sound smaller. The cemetery sat on a hill outside town with bare trees and crooked old stones and the sort of silence that makes people tell the truth because there's nowhere else for it to go. Blake was already there, hands in his coat pockets. For a while we just stood looking at Mom's name. Then he said, I signed the repayment agreement. I heard. I'm selling the lake house. That got my attention. Dad's lake house had always been Blake's favorite symbol of having made it. You don't have to do that legally. No, he stared at the stone. Maybe I do morally. I let that sit. He swallowed. I also called Elena Ruiz and apologized. She didn't forgive me. That seems reasonable. He nodded. Yeah. Wind moved through the trees. Then he said, do you think Dad loved me? It sounded less like a question about our father than a question about whether a person can do this much damage and still have been loved properly at all. Yes, I said. I think he loved you badly. Blake laughed, and then, unexpectedly, he cried. Not dramatically. Not the way men cry in movies. Just one hand over his face, shoulders shaking once, then again, like something had finally given way that had been resting for years. I stood there beside him and didn't touch him. Some grief is private even when witnessed. When he could speak again, he said, he loved you badly too. I know. That, weirdly, was the closest we had ever come to sounding like siblings instead of rivals. Months passed. Mercer stabilized. Not magically. Not all at once. We lost some clients we probably should have lost. We earned back others by finally telling the truth about delivery capacity instead of making promises to preserve ego. We replaced Carter's growth roadmap with unglamorous discipline. Marisol got promoted to director of distribution. Nadine trained a younger finance team before retiring again, this time for real. Helen bullied us all into governance reforms we should have had years earlier. I hired a general counsel whose favorite phrase was, no, that is exactly how you get sued. And slowly, something changed in the building. People spoke up sooner. Managers documented problems instead of hiding them to look competent. We formalized the hardship fund under transparent criteria, and every time someone used it, I thought about Dad writing those names in private and wished he had trusted goodness enough to make it policy. I also changed outside the company. I stopped sleeping with my phone under my pillow. I started having dinner with friends without canceling for freight emergencies that someone else could handle. I went to therapy, which I should have done years earlier. The first time I described my father, my therapist said, "It sounds like you were raised to earn oxygen through usefulness." I laughed so hard I cried. Blake, to his credit, stayed away from operations. He took a job 6 months later with a regional nonprofit that helped men coming out of addiction treatment find work and housing. The irony was not lost on either of us. He told me one day over coffee, "Turns out I'm decent at talking to people who know what it means to have wrecked things." "Experience helps," I said. He smiled. Rude. We were never best friends. Real life isn't that tidy. but on holidays, we stopped performing. Sometimes that's enough to call a thing redeemed. About a year after Dad died, I brought the ledger home for the last time. I sat at my kitchen table and turned every page slowly. The early entries no longer looked mysterious. They looked human. A man trying, often quietly, to offset the randomness of suffering. The later entries looked human too. A man trying, often cowardly, to offset the consequences of avoiding harder truths. Both versions were my father. That was the final lesson, I think. People are rarely one thing, and loving them doesn't require lying about the damage they did. I placed Dad's last letter inside the front cover and added one page of my own. I wrote the date. Then I wrote, "The company survived. So did we. Barely at first. Better after the truth." I listed the employee hardship fund, the profit-sharing structure, the new governance rules, and the things we would never again keep off the record in the name of love. Then, at the bottom, I wrote the line I wish someone had written to us much sooner. Protecting someone from consequences is not the same as protecting them. I closed the ledger and tied the elastic band around it. A few days later, I placed it in the company archive, not hidden, not displayed like a trophy, just preserved with the minutes and contracts and photographs that made up our actual history. Because that was what it had become. Not a weapon. Not a secret. A record. Of what inheritance really is. Not always money. Not title. Not property. Sometimes it's the truth someone else was too afraid to say out loud. Sometimes it's a burden. And sometimes, if you're willing to carry it honestly, it becomes the very thing that sets everybody else down. If this story resonated with you, let us know your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your perspective. And if you enjoy meaningful stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more.